Hello everyone, today I am with Ramji Srinivasan. He was the former co-founder and CEO of Counsyl, a women's health genetics company. And how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Awesome. All right, let's start with the first question then. So where did you go to college and what was your major?
I went to Stanford University and my major was computer science.
And where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Long Island, so in Plainview, New York, and I came to California. My brother was at Stanford. He told me about it. I'd never heard of the school, but I saw that, Stanford was in the Final Four in basketball, and I said, there's a university which is good at athletics and also has an engineering department. I got to look into this. Right. That's how I heard about it.
Right. And so how do you think your experience at Stanford has impacted your life?
Well, I mean, Silicon Valley is an extremely entrepreneurial culture, so it's in the DNA, and I think being not necessarily just at Stanford, but in Silicon Valley, it was very useful to be exposed to the idea that something fresh and original is possible. On the East Coast, a lot of the companies and firms have been around for hundreds of years, but right down the street from us on campus, you could see that that's where, people would point out a particular room saying that's where Larry Page and Sergey Brin started Google, this
right.
particular room. So the idea that anything was possible was around you.
Okay. And so what do you think, what were some decisions that were really important that you made that have impacted your career today?
So let's see. I mean, one of the most important decisions was quitting Wall Street to go back to Silicon Valley. That was in 2004. I made the decision. 2006, I finally, did it. But in August 2004, I was working on the Google IPO, and there are 168 hours in a week, and I think I was working like 140.
Wow.
So I was sleeping under a desk. And I remember, we were filing all those papers, and the founders of Google, were, like I said, computer science TAs at Stanford. I'm like, these guys are changing the world. I'm moving around pieces of paper. What am I doing with my life?
Right.
I'm like, I got to get out of here. I got to do something useful with my life. And I was 22 or 23 at the time and decided I just need to go back to Silicon Valley. So that was one of the most important decisions because I knew that I wanted to start a company. I didn't know in what field, and that set me on the path towards eventually entrepreneurship and starting Counsyl.
And growing up, or even now, have you had any mentors or significant figures that have impacted you at all?
Dozens. I mean, I'm very fortunate and lucky to have many mentors along the way. So in terms of within Counsyl, after starting Counsyl, Leo Joseph, who started PA Semi and sold his company to Apple, has been an incredible mentor because he's built a company successfully before. Mm-hmm. He's done it multiple times in multiple different decades and to some of the top entrepreneurs in a different field. Mm-hmm. And then in the kind of popular press, there are all the role models who have built companies who've come before us, Bill Gates, et cetera. So those aren't necessarily mentors, but people that I looked up to along the way.
So yeah. And so having a startup is pretty hard. And so what are some of the hardest things you've had to deal with starting Counsyl?
Oh, people in general, which is like terminating people that are no longer a fit for the job. It seems, you watch TV, people are like, oh, you're fired, et cetera. It seems less business, or it seems less personal than it actually is. Mm-hmm. Now, over time, you can develop that kind of, only a sociopath enjoys firing people, but that's definitely by far the hardest part of the job because you're working with somebody one day and the next day you're not, and then right. You have to look that person in the face, and the person needs to get a new job. They need to start again, and that may be the right decision for the company. Either you and the company and that person, it's not necessarily a reflection on that person. They may not just have been in the right space at that right time to be part of the company, but that's definitely the hardest part of running a company. All the other stuff, it's, learn from the customers, build cash flow, build a profitable company, et cetera.
Right.
That stuff you can learn over time, but the people stuff is by far the hardest part of it.
All right. And how do you deal with failure?
Failure, I think, is very important to, ask what can we do to learn from this moving forward. So, for example, at Counsyl in 2016, beginning of 2017, we had an oncology division that we cut. And the reason we cut it is we were like Rome. Rome tried to overextend itself. We were running a women's health genetic screening lab, which was growing very quickly. Right. And we had this oncology effort, which was draining gross profit from the core business. And we could just feel the tension in terms of, we knew that we were overextended. And then once we saw the math, we saw, well, we can't build a sustainable business by subsidizing this oncology leg of this business anymore. So the failure in that was overextension and lack of good, strategic planning at the outset, and not truly understanding the costs and benefits at the outset. So there are a lot of lessons from that. I think one of the most important is to having a team that can actually introspect and get the root causes right. That taught us a lot about complete focus on the core. The core. If you get your core right, then you can extend to other businesses from a strong core. If your core business isn't working and you extend to other businesses, then you're going to have problems.
Okay, and you talked about how many hours you spent with the Google IPO and now with the startup as well that you just sold. How do you deal with burnout and not having enough motivation?
Well, I think burnout is a artifact of not having quantitative progress on something. So burnout is typically people call it qualitative, but let's just take fitness, for example. If you are consistently increasing a percentage in time on a mile, or lifts, or strength, or you're lowering your body fat or whatever, you don't see those people getting burned out because they have a quantitative measure that they're improving. For a startup, usually when people say burnout, it's because there's a measure that's either flat or not necessarily, they haven't figured out, and not necessarily, again, a fault issue, but it's like they haven't yet figured out what is the way to improve that measure. So when you feel yourself getting burned out, and believe me, rest, recharge, vacation, those things are all important, but also think, taking 2 weeks vacation, if a number isn't moving, isn't necessarily going to solve your burnout problem for you. Fixing the number will help solve your burnout because you'll feel refreshed and energized that your work is making a difference. So my view on burnout is that it's when you're not making analytical progress towards a goal. And that's not, something your boss or your teacher or whatever tells you. It's something that you authentically know moves the needle. And when you know in your heart that's a number that matters and it's moving, then you'll feel better. You won't feel burned out. For example, Prelude is our fastest growing test. It's for women in their first trimester. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely refreshing and energizing to think of that because it reduces unnecessary amnios, fewer women have miscarriages, it's less painful procedures. I hesitate to speak for the team there now, but it's like very few people I think on the Prelude team are going to be very burned out because it's just growing so quickly, and you can just see that patients are energized by it.
I see. And so, what do you think are the best qualities for being a successful entrepreneur?
The best one is listening. So, in terms of, a lot of people think charisma and stuff like that. They read about Steve Jobs or whatever, and oh, you have to be charismatic. It's actually, a lot of the media narratives are somewhat inaccurate. It's listening to the customer and having the ability to listen to the customer and being able to build good teams, I think are totally related. For example, with Foresight, our first test was intended for carrier screening, which is screening 2 prospective parents, and if they both have recessive genetic mutations, then they can unknowingly pass it on to their kids. What we found is, the way we originally pitched this was 100 diseases that we'll test for the price of 1 test. And we went to OBs and told them this, and they said, well, if I'm going to test for 100 disorders, I'm going to find more positive cases. And we said, yeah. So he said, if we find more positive cases, then I have to talk to more patients. We said, yeah. If I have to talk to more patients, I don't make as much money. They're like, oh. So we really had to listen carefully to what they were saying. It's not that they did not want to find at-risk couples. It's not that they want to be derelict at medicine. But they said they needed a workflow that fits their pattern. So that's where we built stuff like couple testing, so both parents can test simultaneously. We get built on dementia counseling, so parents could log into Counsyl.com. But it took listening to the customer and really understanding what their point of view was. Because from the outside in, we were a Silicon Valley company who said more is better. If you're selling a camera to GoPro and one of the cameras is 4 megapixels and the other is 8 megapixels or whatever, and both of them are the same price, GoPro is going to buy the 8 megapixel camera for their... We found that doctors weren't doing this, and the reason why mattered is because their economic incentives were different from what we anticipated. And had we just tried to push a view as opposed to listen to them, it would have been disastrous.
I see. And now Counsyl does numerous tests. It does. You mentioned carrier testing. If someone is a carrier for disease, prenatal testing, and more. What was the initial idea for starting Counsyl?
Oh, well, I mean, our initial idea, so my co-founder and my brother pitched me on the idea that the genome is the next internet, which is kind of like the movie The Graduate, when Dustin Hoffman is going to a party and somebody goes to him and says, I just want to tell you one thing, son, plastics. He's like, yes, sir. He's like, it's going to be big, plastics. So we didn't know, exactly how the next few years would unfold, but the price of a genetic sequence was dropping dramatically. It was going from $3 billion to $8,000 or $3,000. And our precept at the time was that we could write applications on top of that, genetic code. And as we did that, the first applications we tried to look at were like cognitive disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, trying to predict based on somebody's genetic code whether they're likely to get it or not. And we ran into two problems. Number one is we couldn't computationally predict from somebody's genetic signature whether they'd get something, whether they'd get Alzheimer's or whatever, Parkinson's or whatever cognitive disorder. The second part was that nobody cared. In that even if we found out that they got, some likelihood of Parkinson's, there wasn't much they could do. So we went back to the drawing board and looked at recessive, carrier screening where if two parents are positive, then they're at risk for something that they can unknowingly pass on to their kids. Sure. So our first idea was totally wrong, and this idea that, basically writing applications on top of the genome, because as we went to OBs, no mom cared about the genome, no OB cared about it. They all cared about, we want to make sure that our kids are healthy. So we realized we're actually in the women's health, clinical lab business. We're not in the genome business. And that distinction made a big difference in how we introduce new products. We always think about what's the customer pain point first, as opposed to what is the technological solution. If you start with the technological solution, invariably you're force-fitting what the pain point is for a customer. If you start with the customer pain point, you're going to create a solution that actually you'll back solve the technology you need for them.
I see. Okay, and how do you wake up, and when do you wake up, and what's your morning routine like?
So now I wake up at 5, and first thing I do is walk my dog, get some coffee, and check into emails. At the gym at 6, and then you do some meditation later around like 7:30. And then, when I was working, I was in the office around, 8:30 or something like that. Before that, before 2016, I had a later schedule, probably again, morning workouts, but I switched everything from later in the evening to earlier morning. And I find that it's just a good habit nothing good happens late at night. You eat late, eat bad food late at night, watch too much Netflix, go out drinking. It's like there's nothing good that actually happens then. Sure. And I think a lot of the mythology about late night sessions is just that mythology, as opposed to early morning, productivity and driving stuff forward. So I found that has been really helpful, and I never would have expected that I'd be somebody who would do all that stuff, like exercising first thing in the morning. Right. But it's made a big difference in terms of it compounds as like a good habit over time.
I see. And so what's your advice to the next generation for living a meaningful life?
Well, that's a big question, which is like, each person has to find their own meaning. For me, I'm interested in 3 things: health freedom, financial freedom, emotional freedom, which is anything I want to do wants to contribute a little bit of sense of liberty back to people on all those 3 fronts. So when people talk about finding a meaning, that is definitely a path of self-discovery. That could be in whatever it is: nature, finding love, helping people build wealth, prosperity, helping people, cure cancer. But it's something that takes a lot of self-discovery to find. Like Prelude was very satisfying for us because it was solving such a real, demonstrable pain point. So, people say, well, don't listen to what your parents or school, et cetera, says, but take those as inputs. But there's no substitute for, if you want to find really good meaning, it's actually being out in the outside world and understanding what people's problems are. Because as soon as you understand what people's problems are, you're in a position to design solutions around them. Right. And then you can actually, and it's very satisfying to constantly to solve a problem for people and then, work on the next one. So, Yeah, that's the only advice I would have. It would have to be done on a case-by-case basis to get that precise.
Sure. And so now, congratulations, you sold Counsyl to a Myriad Genetics for $375 million. And so now what's your next big goal after this?
Well, now honestly, I'm just going to take some time and relax into a couple of fitness and nutrition ideas that I've been looking at. And, I'm no rush to start something new. So I'll take some time and do a little bit of travel. But I'm talking to other entrepreneurs who are starting their companies, helping to a small extent I can, and taking it day by day. So no rush.
All right. And what do you think is new in the world? What do you think is going to be big in the next few decades?
I definitely think transportation. I mean, it's I guess it's not new anymore, but like traffic is fundamentally an economic problem, which is we had preventive cancer screening reliant tests at Counsyl, which finds cancer early and potentially could put years back on the clock for a young woman.
Sure.
But traffic, literally, there are centuries of human life spent in traffic every single day, literally, and it's an economic problem in that it's artificially low supply in terms of the road as a supply, and the demand fluctuates. So you have wild fluctuations in demand, and all the solutions have been around like, well, in Beijing, let's add more roads or add more supply. But with Lyft and Uber and stuff like that, and Tesla and all the self-driving cars, there may be a way to flex pricing on a per road basis, so that people could pay a surge price for a particular road, and then potentially use those proceeds to fund high energy vehicles or low income transportation, so that you don't have a have-nots issue.
Sure.
So I think transportation will potentially be solved in our lifetime, but the idea that you have to be in traffic for hours at a time in every major city around the world, I don't think is necessarily true. There was a concept that 5 years ago the government needed to run the taxi business, but now there's no government that's running a taxi business. So I think transportation is very, very exciting. Immunology and oncology is also a very interesting idea, that the oncology is actually a disease of the immune system, and increasingly some people view that cancer can eventually be like a chronic condition where it can be treated, monitored, and reversed earlier. So that's something that's pretty neat. Obviously it's a ways off, but I think that'd be pretty cool.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this interview with me.
Anytime.
And have a nice day.
All right. Good luck.
All right.
Thank you.